Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sudozi Finance Friday. I'm here today with Michael Wang, VP of Finance at Pachama. Michael's been there for almost 2 years at this point, and I'm really excited to have Michael be our strategic finance guest of the week. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks, Rose. Happy to be here. Happy Friday.
Thanks. All right, Michael, you've had a really interesting career. Now, we met at Uber, but you certainly worked in a number of different finance functions, including investment banking before that. So maybe let's just go back into your early investment banking days. Quick thoughts on that experience, how you knew finance was a thing for you, and we'll go from there.
Sounds good. Like every bright-eyed college grad, one of the exciting fields that one could enter coming out of school was investment banking. It was really like a place where you can learn to cut your teeth, really build on the foundational skills of what it takes to be a finance professional, right? And there's this like Steve Jobs quote I really like where you can't connect the dots looking forward, right? You can only connect the dots looking backwards, and trust that when you were planning for a present moment, that the dots will somehow connect in the future. And I think that's really true for me. So a lot of the courses I studied in undergrad, whether it's like statistics or macroeconomics and project financing and all the stuff that I did in banking, at the time it felt like really like tedious, and I'm never going to use this again. But when you fast forward 10 years from now and what I'm doing now, a lot of it is very applicable. So obviously during banking, you learn to work really hard, learn to interact with very, very senior executives, work across a variety of industries, and how to pitch something, how to make something sound good for M&A deals. So those are a lot of the things that I took away from my banking experience.
Yeah, and so after a few years there, you wanted to leverage your experience and move into an operating role. So that's what we had the opportunity to meet at Uber. A fun story here in the recruiting process, as many of you can probably relate. As you're moving quickly, you want to standardize the recruiting process, but sometimes things just fall through the cracks. So on my team, Michael actually didn't receive the exercise, and we had to, towards the end of the recruiting process, go back and redo some of the exercises. But I think it just goes to show like the right candidates, and your team is meant to be anyway if it's meant to be. So so you joined at Uber. Share a little bit about some of the early days there, and how you leveraged your experience from investment banking into an operating role.
Yeah, and then also I remember my interview was the first day or first week. You all moved into the new Uber headquarters,
Office.
which
Yeah.
was huge in comparison, I think, to the previous headquarters. So all my interviews were super late. You couldn't find the conference rooms. Everything was built out. I was like the only one in the suit, but yeah, it was fun. I think when I transitioned from banking to Uber, I think what was easy was like the core like technical skills, any like modeling that you would want to do, any Excel, right? Like that's fairly like easy in comparison to what we had to do in banking. I think a couple of things that I had to really learn along the way is one, how do we actually like model the growth drivers and think about what's driving revenue, what's driving a driver incentive, right?
Mm-hmm.
And really like distill it down to the core operating things. Whereas in banking, you're kind of like, oh, okay, 10% growth, great. Like you just kind of, it's like an input to plug into a model. Whereas in an operating role, as I'm sure many viewers of this broadcast will appreciate, like the inputs are really important. Like how do we actually get inputs, and how do we discuss that? And that's a really key learning I had. And the second thing was you're really interacting with way more stakeholders at a company than you do in consulting and accounting in finance, right? Where you're just really dealing with maybe a C-suite, maybe a buy-side investor. But here you're dealing with engineers, you're dealing with marketing, you're dealing with product.
GMs.
Exactly. Everyone has their own biases. Everyone has their own motivation. So like I think I really learned to like think like what are my motivations if I were them, and then how much do they know about this topic. And I think one of the things that I've gotten good at is to really distill complex topics into really basic explanations based on what I think they know. I think like no understanding your audience in a finance role, in any role, is like it's critical. So I try to make sure that I can always explain things simply. And when you can explain things simply, that's actually showing your understanding of a topic. If it's like super complex, it may actually mean you don't know the topic as well as you do.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I remember you being able to look at the data and say, oh, like these are the actual drivers, and not only build the model and have the data in the model, but then also explain it to, a variety of stakeholders, including legal, right? Who's, very important in making some pricing decisions on why this is important. And so being able to sort of pivot that data and share it in a relevant way to different parties, I think super critical. We're going to jump forward in your career a little bit and talk about Zillow for a minute or two, because it's such a different industry and different business model. And maybe if you could share how that experience at Zillow then also bridged to the role and your experience on financials and accounting and all that good stuff at Pachama, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think at Zillow, probably I learned a couple of things. One was what it really took to build a startup within a large company, which was like maybe a skill gap that I didn't have in my career at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I joined Uber when they were like medium size, and I was there when they left. And right after Uber, I joined a really small company, hardware startup, and then was there until they got to like a medium size, and then they got acquired by Amazon. But I didn't really have the experience of like innovating within a large company, right? We're at
Mm-hmm.
Amazon and Microsoft, and there's a legacy business, but then they also incubate new things. So I was a part of Zillow Offers, which was Zillow's foray into buying and selling homes directly from consumers versus just a media platform and website that hundreds of million people use. So there it was, quite challenging. I was one of the first handful of people they hired. It grew really quickly. They hired like 1,000 people in a year, which maybe looking back was too much. But it was, a really fascinating experience. And there I really honed in on like the unit economics of things, and what it really meant to like buy and sell one home, right? And then that's a core
Mm-hmm.
skill that
Mm-hmm.
all finance leaders should focus on and know. I think at Uber it was slightly different, where we didn't maybe like pay attention to that as much, or it was just so like a rider is like we took a maybe very like long term view to that, right? Um, you attract a rider, attract a driver, and try to calculate the LTV.
The lifetime, yeah.
Exactly. Whereas like a home, like you really better make money in that like one transaction, because
Single, yep.
selling and buying a home maybe like 5-10 years from now. And things similar to Uber is very operational, very complex. You got to get really good into forecasting where home prices are going to be in 9 months. So that was both like the challenging and the fun part of the business.
Yeah, and if you could share any sort of, because you don't come from an accounting background, and so any sort of fun facts or stories learning accounting on the job at Zillow that you can share with the group, or anything to be aware of.
Yeah, I think for Zillow, I was actually in a slightly different role, which I can kind of just talk about in a sec. But I actually wasn't super close in accounting at Zillow. I actually was, because I was one of the first handful of people at Zillow Offers. I did a variety of things. Like my first week, I was on Wall Street and raising bank money from Credit Suisse.
Wow.
And then the next week, my second week, I was like in this Seattle office and learning how like the product works. So it was pretty interesting. And I eventually moved into a business development role, where at first, again, going back to how the dots connect, it was really interesting. It was something I did much before, where I was like trying to interact with external parties, getting them to do partnerships with us, right? So there I was in charge of our home builder program. So when someone's buying a new home, they sell their existing home to Zillow. We partner with the nation's largest builder at the time, D.R. Horn. So this is just like a very soft side of my job where I didn't think I knew what I was doing, where I've always been like a quantitative person. But I think that experience, like I knew I didn't want to do like BD forever, but I think when it comes to a senior role in finance and a senior role anywhere, like most of the role is sales and people management, right? Communication. So that's where I got a lot more comfortable getting on stage, right? Talking at shows, picking up the phone and cold calling folks. I know that's not what he asked, very different candidate, but I think it was a good skill for finance leaders to develop.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Got a few more minutes here. I'd love to chat more about how you thought about your personal transition to climate and Pachama specifically, and would love to hear what your role is like today.
Yeah. As I was wrapping up Zillow and I was thinking about what I really wanted to do next, I was also expecting a kid. So it was one of those like existential moments in my life. Like, what I want him to remember me as. Climate change was something that was really like close to my heart, just because of personal reasons. I wanted to contribute and be a part of the solution. And I learned about Pachama through one of our seed investors, who is on the board of Pachama. He was one of the co-founders of Uber. And it just really seemed like a fascinating solution to a problem. So at Pachama, we're a technology platform for nature-based carbon credits. We use satellites, machine learning, AI to detect and quantify the carbon impact of a project. So when a conservation project happens, you're protecting trees or you're planting trees, how do we measure like how much carbon is being sequestered, right, or protected versus the baseline of what will happen otherwise? And how do we replace manual human labor of using measuring tapes to measure these trees, and doing that much more cost-effective way and much more transparently using satellites and all the great tools that we have in this day and age. So my role here is overseeing the finance, accounting, and legal team. And job is super interesting. I really think about it as we're in the early innings of a new industry. So it's kind of like joining Coinbase in 2012 or Amazon in 1997, where you get to invent a lot of things. It's also challenging because there's no way things have been done.
There's no precedent. Yeah.
So, but as it relates to like finance, it makes the job really interesting because you get to create and innovate and do project financing and all this cool stuff and create a new asset class. And super early stages, and we're building a team on top. So all day to day, typical problems that finance individual have, we're seeing that as well here.
Yeah. I know one thing that people are generally curious about, and also managing on their own balance sheet, is just particularly in this new business model. How do you think about the cash P&L burn versus any sort of accrual or bookkeeping adjustments, and anything that's more GAAP aligned, and how do you bridge those things between both your team as well as the broader company?
Yeah, I think about like the CFO, finance head's job is ultimately a capital allocator, and I've told this to the rest of my executive team. Like, imagine we have 100 M&Ms on a table, right? How do we distribute that between different initiatives? This much for headcount, this much for sales and marketing, and what is the right mix such that we maximize our sales and eventually profitability and make our business successful. So for us, there's two core pieces of how we spend money. One is more like the day-to-day running the business. We spend obviously a lot of money on building a team and hiring great talent, and trying to balance hiring aggressively even in this market, right? Because there's not a lot of talent being available, but also being, of course, mindful of burn and cash runway, and what are the business initiatives and people that are really driving results, and what is the right mix, maybe call it like 80%, on shorter term revenue generating
Mm-hmm.
activities, and then more like futuristic R&D, which we're doing a lot of, right? Because we're developing the future, but
Yeah.
it might be like 50% R&D, because then your cost basis is doesn't support a
Yeah.
healthy business. So that's one piece. And then the second piece for us is really around spending money to start new projects, which we're getting into. So we have an existing business that we're reselling and verifying existing carbon credits, but we're also developing our own projects in Mexico and Brazil and various parts of the US. So those are very capital intensive businesses. So trying to figure out, do we want to use our balance sheet for that? Do we want to use customer upfront purchases? Do you want to raise debt? Do you want to raise project financing? We have a variety of thoughts and solutions we're pursuing. That also takes up a big part of my time.
Yeah. In terms of your role today, in this, finance role, how much, we talked earlier about, you don't want to do fully sales and cold calling. How much of your role is also sort of a business development role, a strategy role, and versus quantitative? If you could generally share that split, I'd be curious to hear what that is.
Yeah, it's probably like 50-50. I think we're a little bit more strategic than I wouldn't say like other. Like, I think because we're so early in both the company life cycle and the industry life cycle, that a lot of the finance roles is to center around like, how do we structure the best commercial contracts, right? How do we think about where the industry is growing, and our challenge is not, there's not enough business opportunities. There's like so much white space, and what is like
Mm-hmm.
prioritization of activity. So again, I go back to like the Amazon analogy, where they started off by doing books, right? And then they're like, okay, maybe we should do DVDs and music, and there's like a very specific sequence where they expanded, and then now they own like grocery stores and everything, right? But they didn't start off by saying, I'm going to do everything. So for us, similarly, how do we expand our business line toolbox? So it's a very strategic part of planning our finances.
Nice. All right. As we wrap up here, any last plugs for Pachama? Anything you want to share? Any specific roles? And then I have one last question for you as a finance leader, and we'll wrap up here.
Sure. Yeah. No specific plugs, but I just encourage folks to really, find what you're really passionate about. It's cheesy as it sounds, because I think that the tools of finance you can use at any company, and I think especially in this macro environment, one of the most useful jobs is finance, right? Like, how do we actually be disciplined and use money wisely? So I think figure out like what it is you want to apply your talents to, and really go after it. Pachama, we are looking for accounting folks. We're looking for capital markets to help us raise a fund that's very innovative. And so there's a lot of innovative things you can do within finance. And if your companies who are watching are looking to get to net zero, thinking about ESG and reducing your carbon footprint, you can check out Pachama, learn about ways that we can give you the highest quality carbon credits as part of your net zero journey.
Great. All right. Final question for you, Michael. Now that you're in this spot, you've seen a lot in various investment banking and also operating finance roles. What's one thing earlier in your career you wish you spent more time on?
Probably two things. One is I talked about like the external piece. I think I
Yeah.
wish I did that even earlier. Like, so even
Yeah.
though you're like in the first 5 years of your career, I think a lot of folks just feel really comfortable just behind like a laptop and plowing away at a model, but not really get into the habit of presenting it, not get a habit of talking to external stakeholders and like hearing what's on the market and translating that into quantitative analysis. So I wish that I did that earlier. And then the other piece of what I wish I did earlier. It's probably um, around maybe like, it's probably just the core like FP&A function. So my background is a little unique where I've had little bits pieces of it, mostly at my hardware startup, but at Uber, at Zillow, I didn't really have like the full view of the company.
Mm-hmm.
And then every time someone said the word expenses, I just like got allergic to it because I like, oh, that's so boring. I don't want to like have a budget. Like that sounds like not cool, right? Or not fun. But in the grand scheme of things, going back to the M&M example, it's actually really strategic how you allocate resources. And obviously, there's some of the conversations when you have to have like setting budgets. If you are missing budgets, those are not always the funnest. But how you justify budgets is actually very strategic. And
Yeah.
usually, what I've learned is cross-functional team members, they look up to finance as guidance. So actually having seen, at least internally at Pachama, as much pushback as I expect, and people really look to us as like, okay, how much should we be spending, and giving
Mm-hmm.
them a kind of a finance guidance versus them just telling us how much they need.
Amazing. I love that. Sort of that core P&A skill set earlier on, and really understanding the strategic nature of that budget allocation and enforcing it, and how to get alignment on that. All right. Well, thank you, Michael. We've definitely gone above our budgeted time here, but hope that's okay by a few minutes. Thanks everyone for joining, and we'll catch you next week. All right. Thanks again, Michael.
Thanks,
Bye.
Rose.